class, and welcome to week 3 of History of the Western World 503 Monarchs of Tudor England. I'm Heather Anderson, and this week we will discuss Henry VIII, the English Reformation, and the dissolution of the monasteries. Last week, we talked about Henry VIII's achievements, such as building England's first navy and the founding of Trinity College at Cambridge University. He ruled over a court that embraced new ideas, art, architecture, learning, and music. But despite those achievements, Henry VIII became known as a tyrant king. One of those reasons, and arguably one of England's most tragic events, was the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries. To understand the reason for this, we must first discuss the role religious houses played in England before the dissolution. There were roughly 900 religious houses in England. There were approximately 12,000 people who were monks, canons, friars, or nuns, equating to about one adult for every 50 men that were in religious orders. Religious houses dominated the landscape, and churches were the largest buildings that could be seen from miles away. Monks, nuns, and friars were a familiar part of everyday life in the early 16th century. Religious houses were involved with hospitality, charity, artistic and musical patronage, scholarship, and education. Hospitality was given to those who needed it. It was their obligation to provide food and lodging to travelers and help with alms and doles for the poor. They also offered spiritual comfort. They were places of respect and held a place in English society. In 1534, King Henry VIII declared himself head of the Church in England. This break with the Pope led to the Protestant Reformation in England. One of the lasting effects of the English Reformation was the dissolution of the monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries resulted not only from a desire to reform the church, but also from King Henry VIII's desire for wealth and a quest to secure his status as the supreme head of church and state, forever changing life in England. The English Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries was a long and complex process. After King Henry VIII met Anne Boleyn in 1535, he was determined to be with her. At the same time, he was convinced that God disapproved of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because she was first married to his brother who had died. The marriage produced a daughter, the future Queen Mary Tudor, and several miscarriages, but no male heir. He saw this lack of a son as God's disapproval of the marriage, and in 1527, Henry VIII's chancellor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, wrote to Rome and stated Henry wanted a divorce. Pope Clement VII did not grant this divorce and told Henry that he would be excommunicated if he married again. In response to the Pope, Henry broke with the Catholic Church, asserting independence for England. This was the beginning of a series of church reforms that would lead to what is now known as the Anglican Church. There was real need for church reform in the 1530s. Before Parliament met in 1529, Simon Fish published a tract called A Supplication for the Beggars. In this pamphlet, Fish asked the king to dissolve the monasteries. He claims that the poor had been reduced to beggars, while the monasteries take the money and become rich, promising to pay for a soul's quick passage through purgatory. Like Martin Luther, Fish rejects the sale of indulgences and contests the idea of purgatory. These sturdy, idle, holy thieves do not help the poor, but increase their misery. He also accuses the clergy of enticing women to sin through sexual promiscuity, spreading diseases and corrupting a whole generation. Fish also discusses the power and wealth of the church. He claims that the clergy have a third of the king's realm, a tenth of his produce, and receive a tenth of the servants' wages. He accuses the clergy of extorting the poor and asks the king to avoid his own ruin by making laws ensuring the monasteries will no longer have this much power. In the 1530s, the king and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, began a project that would lead to the dissolution of the monasteries. This started with the assertion of the king's supremacy over church and state, which included annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and reforming the church, while coincidentally increasing royal finances by acquiring the church's wealth. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which declared that the king, as well as his heirs and successors, were the head of the Church of England. This ensured that the king shall have full power and authority, severing ecclesiastical ties with Rome. Commissioners were then sent around the country, collecting oaths of supremacy from monastic houses. Sorry. Few opposed and most rejected the Pope to accept the king as head of the church, with a few notable exceptions. Robert Hobbes, abbot of Woburn in Bedfordshire, denied royal supremacy and was charged with treason. He was found guilty and hanged outside his own monastery. The heads of Colchester, Reading, and Glastonbury were also executed. After the break with Rome, Thomas Cromwell was appointed as the vicegerent in spirituals in 1535. His new role was to assert royal authority over the monasteries. He conducted a great survey by visiting the monasteries, the Valor Ecclesiasticus, to gain information on monastic wealth for taxation purposes. By submitting to this visitation, monks, nuns, and friars were submitting to the new order. The visitation also examined the conditions of the monasteries, the quality of leadership the abbots provided, the monks' and nuns' commitment to their vocation, as well as chastity and obedience to their house. Following the visitation, the Compendium Copernatorium, or the Book of Findings, was compiled in 1536. This book was evidence of sexual misconduct found during the visitation. Scholars today see this as an invented way to damn the monks and nuns while discrediting religious orders. The Valor Ecclesiasticus and the Compendium Copernatorium were used as evidence against the monasteries. And in 1536, an act for the dissolution of smaller monasteries was passed. This made it legal to suppress all religious houses with an income below £200 a year, and around 400 houses were dissolved, enforced by a mix of local gentry and officials. Some chose to leave monastic life, with former monks finding work as secular priests, while many decided to stay and were transferred to larger houses. The suppression of the smaller monasteries led to revolt in 1536, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Monasteries were valued in the north of England, where they provided services and hospitality to the poor in the bleak upland areas. Robert Aske, a lawyer in Yorkshire, led an uprising of the common people who were protesting economic and social changes being imposed by their remote government in London. They wanted the monasteries restored and preserved. This revolt attracted widespread support, which King Henry VIII saw as a challenge to his authority. When more revolts broke out in the north, the king ordered the executions of around 200 people. The dissolution of the monasteries, however, would continue. And in 1539, Parliament passed the Second Dissolution Act, also known as the Suppression of Greater Houses Act, confirming the Crown's right to the land that had been surrendered. It was now legal for monasteries to be dismantled, relics and land sold, and the profits to go into the king's treasury. King Henry VII left a vast fortune after his death. King Henry VIII used that money to fund his war against France. The dissolving of the monasteries would provide enough funds to continue his lifestyle and fund future wars against France and Scotland. However, King Henry VIII did not have a long-term goal with his future income. He sold off the assets and the land and spent the money quickly. The church was no longer a threat to King Henry VIII's supremacy, and gave the king enough wealth to fund his lavish lifestyle and his quest for power. Some religious houses were converted into secular mansions, estates, or farms. Larger religious houses were dissolved, including those where the king's own family was buried. The king's acknowledged bastard son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, was buried in Thetford Priory in Norfolk. In 1535, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, petitioned the king to save Thetford Priory, arguing that since the king's own son was buried there, the priory could be changed to a secular church. However, King Henry VIII decided the priory was to be dissolved, and on February 16, 1540, Prior William and his 13 monks signed the deed of surrender. The remains of the people who were buried there were taken to Framlingham, over 30 miles away for reburial. The king's sister Mary Tudor, former Queen of France, was buried at Bury St. Edmund's Abbey in Suffolk. After the dissolution, she was reburied in nearby St. Mary's Church. Michael Sherbrooke, a rector of Wickersley, a child at the time of the dissolution of Roche Abbey in 1538, provides an account of his father and uncle's memories of the process of the dissolution. On July 23, 1538, Abbot Henry Cundall of Roche gathered with 17 monks of Roche Abbey in the chapter house and signed the surrender deed. The keys to the abbey were given to the commissioners, who took an inventory of all possessions and livestock, as they were now property of the crown. Each monk was given a pension, the price relating to his standing with the abbey. The abbot was given an extra 30 pounds, his books, household items, a chalice, vestment, a quarter of the abbey's plate, several cows, and a portion of corn. The monks received a half-year's allowance, while the servants received a half-year's wages. Once the monks had left the abbey, the buildings were destroyed to make sure that it could not be restored. Sherbrooke recalls that each monk was given nothing of value except for their bed and clothes. One of the monks tried to sell his uncle a door for 2 pennies. Later, other townspeople came to buy corn and hay. When they arrived, they found all the doors were open, the locks and shackles had been pulled off, doors had been removed. They entered the abbey and began to steal what they liked: service books, pewter vessels, windows, iron hooks, timber. The lead of the church was torn off, tombs were broken into. Everything of value was spoiled, plucked away, or utterly defaced. After the church was plundered, the townspeople plundered the abbot's lodging, the dormitory, the refectory, the cloister, and other buildings within the abbey walls. After the abbeys and friaries fell, there was an attack on famous shrines and former sites of pilgrimage. In 1538, the tomb of St. Edmund in Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk was dismantled. The shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury was also dismantled. This process was the same as the monasteries. Plates and jewels were sent to the royal treasury, and everything else, including the lead from the roofs, were taken. In some places, the buildings were completely dismantled, the stonework carried off for reuse, while the rest was left to decay. After the religious houses were dismantled, the monks, nuns, and friars needed somewhere to go. In the monasteries that were made into cathedral churches, monks were allowed to stay and become secular canons. Those that were dispossessed had to be taken care of by the government. The heads of the religious houses were treated well if they fully cooperated. Around 30 ex-abbots became bishops, and the rest received pensions averaging £5 a year. The dissolution cast out over 11,000 former monks and nuns. Even after paying them pensions, King Henry VIII had become the richest king England had ever known. Not only did the dissolution of the monasteries have a profound impact on the English landscape, but it also impacted English society. The monasteries spent much of their resources on the community. Weary travelers no longer had a place to spend the night in an era without large numbers of hotels and hostels. Larger religious houses provided medical care and grew their own medicinal herbs. They were often the only place the sick could go during an epidemic or plague. Poor children were no longer able to get an education. Convents often provided the only education available for girls. Religious houses also aided the poor. After the dissolution, the poor no longer had the help they needed, which caused an increase in beggars and vagrants. The dissolution of the monasteries has been known as a time of great destruction to religious houses, destroying valuable books and art for King Henry VIII to gain wealth. However, the dissolution was about more than wealth. Asserting control as the head of the new English church was vitally important to the king. Taking the church's wealth and land ensured that the church would not be a competition to the monarch or his heirs. Today, the ruins of monasteries and priories dot the landscape of England as a reminder of the Protestant Reformation and the legacy it left behind. If you ever get the chance, they are well worth the visit. The Protestant Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries produced a divide between England's Catholic and Protestant population, creating religious turmoil that would last for generations.